Bob works as the exhibits director and retail manager at Minnetonka Center for the Arts. He does the selecting, the curating, the installation of the exhibits, as well as scouting, the studio tours, art fairs, online resources in search of new artists. All of these things give him a chance to experience and learn about a broad range of our region's material culture. He's also had the chance to watch many of the pairs of jurors thoughtfully consider the hundreds of entries for the Minnetonka Center for the Arts juried shows, making selections which to an artist whose work was selected or was not selected could have seemed random or maybe difficult to understand. Bob's going to discuss strategies with us for deciding what to enter, the jury's process of selecting a show, questions to be considered about what it means to have your work selected or not selected, and ideas for getting the most out of your participation in a juried show. So with that, we welcome Bob, and Bob, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. I have had many experiences over quite a number of years now to watch jurors in action here at the Minnetonka Center for the Arts, to jury shows as a guest juror, to submit artwork, which I have had juried in or juried out of other shows. And I've also, as a potter selling work at art fairs and shows, had the experience of prepping bodies of my work for shows where, you know, admittedly, I was the decider in what got shown and what got put out. But that's another experience in which you get a chance to do what you're doing whenever you enter a show or whenever you apply for something with your work, which is you get to decide on how to represent what you do with some subset of your work. And whether it's 1 or 3 pieces that you're entering in a juried show, whether it's, you know, maybe 10 or 12 pieces that you're submitting for an exhibition proposal, whether it's dozens of pieces that you're going to get to put in an art fair booth that you're setting up, that experience of deciding how you're going to present yourself to somebody, what subset of your work you want to put forward. It's always a little stressful, and sometimes it's not successful, but it always can be educational. And what I would like to talk about tonight with regard to entering artwork in shows is how you can get something out of that activity, whether or not you get in. And I'd like you to be able to feel better about the process of it and maybe the intentions that come out in the process of selecting shows too. Because I think if we can unload some of that selection process, I think if we can unload some of that, what does it mean to get in or not to get in? I think we can approach the show in a more positive way. I think we can feel better even if we don't get what we want. And we can focus where we should be focusing, which is on our art and what we did or didn't learn from the experience. There's a terrific movie from, I think, 1998 called The Last Days of Disco, in which a group of professionals in Manhattan are going out to the discos every night after work, and they're meeting and dating each other in various combinations. And at some point, the only 2 people who haven't dated so far are kind of walking along, and they're having one of those days that maybe is one of those days when you can feel your relationship is changing a little bit, and maybe you're going to date. Maybe this is going to turn into something more serious. And she's telling him, well, I've been dating a lot. I kind of decided to give myself some time off and give that a rest a little bit. And, you know, maybe this isn't going to work for me. And he looks right at her and he says, you know, I'm not like those jerks who can't take no for an answer. I will take no for an answer. And he kind of oversells it, which makes the show funny for me. But the willingness to take no for an answer, even though it doesn't always get us what we want, is kind of an essential part of applying to be in anything, really. And we kind of have to get that in line before we apply. I mean, if you would accept a yes, you kind of have to accept a no too, which I mean, it makes sense when you just think about it like that, but in the context of applying for a show and not getting what you wanted out of the experience, that can be really frustrating. I started to think a lot about why someone should be in a juried show or attempt to be in a juried show, why someone should submit their work to someone else's opinion or someone else's jurying. When I was seeing in our juried shows here at the Arts Center, a lot of people getting involved who were excited to be in a show and they were excited to apply for something, but it felt like they had not prepared themselves realistically for the possibility of not getting in. And obviously not getting in is not as fun as getting in. But because they hadn't prepared themselves realistically for the possibility of not getting in, I think it hurt more and it was more surprising than it needed to be. And I think it took a lot of their energy that they should have had for their art and kind of turned the process into a negative thing. And I was kind of thinking about why in the world someone should submit their work for a yes or no, or a thumbs up or a thumbs down like that. What are you getting out of that? Why should you do that? And one of the things I started doing was to change the way that we talked about the juried show to our constituents. We didn't talk about it anymore as this thing that everyone should do. We talked about it specifically as a competitive event, which was designed for people who are prepared to be in a competitive event. And we encouraged people to think about whether or not they were really ready to take no for an answer and understand that someone else getting into the show might mean that you don't. And that's what a competitive event is. That's how it works. Apart from cautioning people a little bit about what entering a juried show means, though, you kind of have to think about why you should go through it in the first place. Why should you take the risk? What is there in that event that's so important? Because even as we're cautioning people who might not have thought realistically about what they would do with a refusal or a rejection, it still begs the question of why do the people who do get in, why are they valuing that? What are they getting out of it? What is so important about submitting your work to somebody else for that kind of judgment? The process of accepting other opinions about your work, the process of evaluating whether or not there's something in that opinion that you can learn from or benefit from, is really an important part of putting your work out and being able to defend it or decline to discuss it with someone who just is not going to get it. It's kind of, unless we plan to hide all of our work, it's kind of a basic part of putting our work out there, is being able to talk about why we do what we do, why it's right for us, why we're doing it that way, and to feel like we've really approached our work thoughtfully and considered the options that are available to us. So I'd like you to think about a juried show or any kind of an application where you have to apply. I'd like you to think about that as an opportunity to get something out of it, even if you don't actually get what you want, even if you get a no, even if you get a decline. Think about it as a chance to evaluate your work. You have to decide what you're going to submit. It might be 1 or 3 pieces for a juried show, or it might be a couple of dozen pieces because you're applying for a gallery show. Or you might be setting up an art fair booth and you get to put in 50 or 60 pieces. It's all the same. You have to decide how you're going to represent yourself, what subset of your work you're going to put out there to represent you. And in the process of doing that, you're going to pick some things over others. You're going to have a chance to think, not just, am I representing myself the way I want to, but what else might you do? When you get your work together, does it look like anything's missing? How might you develop your ideas? Does putting your work together and thinking about which things you should enter, does that remind you of some things you were thinking of trying? Does that remind you of some ways in which you thought maybe at one point you could expand what you do that you've kind of let go by the wayside? You have a chance to get everything together as you're trying to represent yourself, and you can look and you can see, am I leaving something behind? Am I forgetting something? Are there ideas I've kind of passed by that I should go back to and consider. That can be really valuable. And sometimes in the process of making pieces, we kind of forget to get everything we're doing together once in a while and ask ourselves, is this getting us where we're trying to go? Or are we forgetting about some things we meant to do? We can also identify as we get our work together for something like this, we can identify that we might have different kinds of things going on with our work. It might not all be the same. It might not be a unified body of work. We might have a couple different points of view or a couple different styles that we work in. And we can think about that too. Does one of those subjects or does one of those styles open more opportunities for us than the other? Is there some way that we can work the fact that maybe we work in more than one way? Can we match that to different events? Do we need to think more carefully about which kind of work we put in which events? There's that opportunity too. And if we're just always working on the next piece, if we're always just taking our work one at a time, we don't always have the chance to think about it tactically like that. So in the process of getting your submission together for an event, you have the chance to kind of consider your work almost as a juror might. You know, you can kind of pre-jury what you're doing. What are my best pieces? Which of my pieces hold together? Which of my pieces constitute a body of work that has some cohesion and makes some strong arguments about what I can do? Which of my pieces are experimental pieces? You can start kind of looking at your work almost like you're the juror. And you can maybe start to understand how somebody else would look at your pieces. Even, of course, as the maker, you're kind of inclined to like what you do. I mean, that's healthy, that's good. But that opportunity to look at your work, figure out how you want to represent yourself, and start to get a sense of what your work might look like to somebody else is valuable. It tells you something about your work. There are people who write about entertaining, and they talk about how by the time they've decided what recipe they want to make, and they've cleaned up the house, and they've done a little decorating, they put out some flowers, and the cooking is done either by them or someone else. And they've got it all set up, and the house is clean, and it looks great, and it smells terrific. And some of them talk about how at that moment, what they really wish is that their guests wouldn't come at all, and they could just sit down and be done with the night because they've kind of done it all. It's all set, right? That's kind of an antisocial approach to entertaining, obviously. But going through your work before a show, or going through your work as you prepare a submission for a gallery application, can feel a little bit like that in a good way. You can get to the end of evaluating your work, getting your pieces together, trying to figure out how you want to represent yourself, seeing where your strengths and weaknesses seem to be. And by the time you've looked at all of your work like that and given some thought to your work, maybe in the same way that the jurors would, you can kind of end up thinking often, well, however this goes, I've really gotten something out of looking at my work closely and trying to kind of put together or fail to put together the directions in which I'm going, the statements that I'm making, the themes I'm exploring. My goal would be for you to feel that way about preparing your work for anything, that by the time you've considered what you do and considered how you want to present yourself and tried to imagine how someone else might see that,
And then,
you might
down
feel
below
that you
the
have a
unit
benefit
and
out of
go,
that,
United Arab Emirates Republic.
and that it doesn't necessarily depend
this
on
thing.
whether or not you get into the event that you're trying to get into. Maybe just as an exercise, you've already gotten something out of it. So I think before you enter your work in something, I think you have to think a little bit about what that juried event or what that application means to you. Is this kind of a competitive contest? Are you trying to win something? Do you feel like the person or people jurying the show do you feel like they have a seal of approval to hand out? Do you feel like this is a resume line that you need? Or are you prepared, even if you might like those things, are you prepared to look at this as a tool for your artistic development? And I think if you're willing to look at the work that you do before you submit something, evaluating your work, thinking tactically about what to submit, I think you'll regard applying for things as a good artistic development tool, a way to kind of clean house a little bit, a way to evaluate yourself. You know, the show so far, see what you're doing, what seems to be missing, what could be better. If you apply for one show, if you apply for one thing, the yes or no that you get just means yes or no about that one particular thing. It's hard to argue that that has told you a lot about your work. But if you make a practice of applying for things and entering shows, you will over time collect a number of experiences, and that number of experiences could start telling you about your work. It could start telling you that some kinds of your work are more likely to get into shows than others. It could give you ideas about which direction to push your work. It could just make you better at picking out the pieces of your work that are unique enough to jury well. On the other side of the equation, you have people whose job it is to pick the show. And when you don't get into a show, it feels like they didn't like you. It can feel, well, it feels like rejection. I mean, people talk about getting into a show or being rejected from a show. I usually encourage people to say they were not accepted rather than rejected. I think in the process of applying for shows and in the process of helping yourself help that non-acceptance land a little more lightly, it's important to have a sense of humor about the whole thing. Don't take it all too seriously. One of my first jury experiences that happened for a fair I really wanted to get into was in the practice, this group was in the practice of sending your jury scores to you, not as a compiled score that some third party put together, but they sent you the jurors' actual slips of paper that they were writing on when they evaluated you. I think they thought this was helpful. And, you know, maybe sometimes it was, but I remember opening up this envelope with my entry and my non-acceptance and the three kind of crumpled up juror slips in which each juror had recorded what they thought of my work and how they scored it. And there was a craftsmanship score, and there was probably some kind of artistic impression score. And then there was a first impression score. And on one of my slips, the juror had circled one number for the first impression score, and then erased it and circled a different number for the first impression score. And so I was sitting there with my non-acceptance and my juror slips, and I just started laughing because here this juror was basically telling me, on second thought, my first impression of your work is this and not this. We're not always going to get a laugh out of our non-acceptances, but we've got to take it when we can get it. I've always kind of treasured that memory of the second thought first impression score, because it kind of throws into high relief the fact that there's a human element here. There really is. And the people who are jurying a show they're there because they like art. They're not there because they don't like art. If you didn't like art, jurying a show would be excruciating. It would be like torture. They're there because they like art. And the more art they've seen, the more qualified they are to judge a show, the more kinds of things they probably like. So we have a right to be optimistic about who's looking at our work and who's selecting it.
Excuse me, Bob, we have,
Yes.
if you don't mind, we have two questions and they're kind of centered around what you're talking about. And I'm wondering if
Good.
you'd like to grab those questions real quick. I'll
Let's do it.
Okay. The first one is, how does a juror or jurors get selected to jury a show? That's the first question.
Oh, I like that one. Sometimes the juror has been found by people who are really weighing whether or not the juror has experience in evaluating all the different things they're going to be seeing. And sometimes the juror is who somebody knows. I mean, that's the truth of it. And no one is deliberately selecting someone who doesn't know everything they're getting into. but sometimes that happens. And that's part of the human element in all this. You will enter shows which leave you with the impression when you see the final selections, this person really knew what they were doing, or these people really knew what they were doing. And then unfortunately, you will see other shows where you're left with the impression that this person maybe was in a little over their head in some areas and didn't know who to ask.
Right. Or had two first impressions. Right.
Or right, had changed their mind about their first impression. Exactly.
All right. Thank you. Our second question is, how does getting into a high profile juried show help an artist's career? That's the first part of it. And the second part is, if people review your resume and don't know one show from another, does it make any impacts getting into a juried show?
Well, I mean, there are people who just are trying to fill their resume with anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, every line is a good line, you know, and that's certainly true when you're starting out. I mean, there's some value in communicating to people. I'm putting my work out there and I'm showing my work.
Right.
You know, so long before we parse which of those lines are important shows and which of those lines aren't important shows, I would throw out there, as you're starting to show your work, it's all good. You know, you have a mission to prove to whoever looks at your resume that you're getting your work out there.
Right.
Because that is part of your job. Get your work out there and defend it if necessary. Talk about it with people who would like to. Get used to everybody not loving it. Just, you know, thicken your skin a little bit and start that process. The high profile shows, you know, when you can start adding very good, very prestigious shows to your resume,
Mm-hmm.
that could help buyers at some point who are wondering, do enough important people like this person's work that I should like it too? I mean, there are buyers who are looking for that other piece of information. There are gallerists who aren't sure what they think of your work, but if they look at your resume and you've been in a lot of important shows, that could nudge them. That happens.
All right.
That happens.
Thank you.
It's not at all a bad thing.
Right. Right.
I
Okay.
think there are a lot of people out there who are perfectly comfortable trusting their own eye in evaluating your work. And they are going to recognize when something is right for the event that they're doing.
Right.
So I think those high profile shows are not essential,
Mm-hmm.
but what a nice thing, you know?
Yeah, that's refreshing. All right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if we get back to the jurors who, you know, have, you know, human failings and things like this, they like art. Hopefully they've been carefully chosen. They not always have, but they often, especially if they're working in a pair, have the benefit of each other's experience, which is kind of valuable because everyone can't be an expert in anything, of course. When you think about the jurors starting to work, they don't really have the time to hold a grudge against certain kinds of work. They're really trying to make a show. You know, they have a show to pick. And they're not going to pick the show by looking for something that isn't in the room or that isn't among the entries. The other entries to the show, whether they're online entries or whether they're physically in the room, the other entries are creating the context in which those jurors are making their decisions about your work. The jurors have to pick a show from what's there. They can't say, well, what we really like is this, you know, this nice, you know, Sargent watercolor from the, you know, from the National Gallery there. That's not available to them. They have to pick what's been submitted. And so the context of the show is the other submissions, and they have to make a show based on what's there. So they're going to be looking at your work probably with some baggage. I mean, we all have that. We all have preferences, things that impress us more than others, but they're really looking at your work in the context of the other submissions. And their job is to come up with a show out of those submissions. And so understanding that their job is not to say no so much as it is to say yes can help you get into a better mood about the idea of having your work judged, because they really are looking for a show. I mean, no juror or juror pair is authorized to come back and say, well, we didn't find anything we liked, forget about your show. You know, it's not going to happen. They're there to say yes, they really are. They're there to pick it. And our job, as we're entering a show, with any luck, is to help make their job easy for them by showing them something that they have to have. So maybe that's a way you can kind of think about how you enter a show. How do I show a couple of jurors something they have to have? How do I make this easy for them? What I like to think about all the time with a show, and it happens every time a show comes in. It happens every time I put out a call for entries. I have this moment where I think, well, maybe this is the time when there isn't any of that work out there. Maybe this is the time nothing will come in. Maybe this is the time no one has anything for this. And then, of course, entries start coming in, and there's wonderful work out there, and people do have work for that, and they are working in that theme. And, you know, all the kind of naysaying and doomsaying goes out the window. And these entries start coming in either electronically or physically for some of our shows. And you immediately see that there's a show there, and the show takes shape right in front of you. And you're going through electronic entries, you're going through a room, and you suddenly see a show, and it kind of reveals itself to you. I remember hearing a novelist talk about how as they wrote a book, they were kind of surprised, or they said they were surprised at what the main character in their book did at one point in the story. The way they described it was, they said, well, what really shocked me was when so-and-so did this. I didn't think he was going to do that. And I just kind of thought, well, you're the writer. Why don't you know what your characters are going to do? But as I thought about it, I realized, well, in the process of writing a book, you probably do get your characters into places where they are going to do something. They are going to do something, in quotes, of course. You're going to have them do something which you didn't necessarily know would be narratively required. And the situation emerges where the character has to do something. You get into a plot situation that can only be resolved by so-and-so doing something you didn't think they were going to do. And then you get to be a novelist, and you go on TV and you say, well, I didn't know that character was going to do that. And people like me hear that and they think, well, that's kind of ridiculous. But shows emerge that same way. You can't make a show be something it's not. The show shows itself to you right there in the room.
Right. I hate to interrupt you, but there's a couple of questions right around that. So I'm not going to give you to exactly in order, but this is, do jurors try and select a broad range of styles and subjects for their shows? And does this also drive their decision, having that diversity in a show?
That's an excellent question. I think almost all jurors in almost all situations are really looking to come up with a show that has variety and the vitality that variety gives it, whether they're dealing with one medium or whether they're dealing with a mix of mediums. I think almost every juror in almost every circumstance is really trying, you know, like in watercolor, the jurors are probably thinking something like, let's really show everything watercolor can do. And then it becomes your job as the entrance to the show to show them everything watercolor can do so that they can represent that. And if the show is more mixed media, the jurors are probably trying to think, and I've seen them talk like this as they're jurying shows. Well, we should include this so we have a bronze in the show, or let's take this so we have a stone in the show. And most of them I've seen and know about are very conscious of trying to create exactly that variety you're talking about.
Right. So this kind of goes with it as well. So so do jurors try to tell a story with the entry, saying that with the submissions they are looking for to create a particular flow, or is it best or more interesting when they decide to bring in entries that have kind of elements of surprise? So
unless the show is I like that question a lot, because I've seen some jurors try to do it and they can't. It's unless the show is very small, I don't think you could try to orchestrate a narrative or a particular flow. And I've seen some jurors try to do that. They've put some things together and they've said, well, we'd like these to be together. And then by the time they finish jurying, they don't really seem to feel that anymore because they've gotten sort of involved in the show as a whole. And the jurors who work at the Art Center come back and see the juried show hung and will frequently say, oh, you put those together, or, oh, there's a whole group of these, or look, there's this feeling that kind of repeats again and again and again, or there seems to be a lot of this theme. They seem kind of to be surprised by seeing the show arranged and installed. And it just becomes clear that in the process of picking a show of any size, you can't really overly orchestrate a narrative or a theme too much.
Right. We had one of our members did say a narrative or a theme is kind of best for more of like a solo show.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point.
And
That's a
then
good point.
and we have one other question. After your art has been selected for one show, can you enter it in another one later?
Well, probably not at the same place. A lot of places will have rules like we do where you shouldn't enter something that's already been shown there.
Mhm.
You know, they want to kind of mix it up. They
Right.
don't want to re-show the same pieces over and over again. But if you send the piece in a lot of different directions, I mean, you might have a group of show pieces that you find jury very well and have something unusual going on in them that one juror after another says, yeah, let's have some of that. And how do you retire that piece, you know?
Right. All right.
So
That's it for questions so far.
So on the
great.
question of the jurors selecting things, I think there's a sense as the pieces come together and the jurors look around the room, there's a sense that the show kind of shows itself to them. The show says, look, here I am. And some of the pieces feel like they're in the show and some of the pieces feel like they're not additive. And it might be because there's a better example that's similar to them, or it might be because they're not just done as well. I mean, there are these pieces that just kind of suggest that, you know, they can be part of some show, but not part of this show. And it's in the process of scrolling through entries electronically or looking at entries in a room. I can't think of a better way to say it than that the show kind of shows itself to you.
Right.
There are pieces that just feel like they have to be in the show, and there are other pieces that feel like they should be in another show or the next show, or, you know, kudos for this to this person for entering a show, but maybe they're not ready yet. It emerges like that. It absolutely does. Now I've talked about how we choose what to enter, and we've kind of touched on the subject of jurors trying to create variety and diversity in a show. You also have to think about whether or not you want to create unity or diversity in what you enter in a show. If you can enter more than one piece, 3 is a number you come across quite frequently. You might be confused if you have different styles, or if you have some different media that you use, you might be confused about whether you should break up your entries or have all of your entries as cohesive as possible. There are jurors who will take, if they like your work, all 3 of your entries. And they won't feel that that's repetitive. They'll feel excited that they've got this group of really high quality work to put in the show. There are other jurors who really are trying to include as much variety as possible. And if you put in a group of 3 closely related pieces, they will take the one they think is best. So you have to decide, are you all in on one thing, or are you going to give them a bunch of different things? My recommendation on that is usually that if your work is more traditional in nature, you can probably afford to put in pieces that are as different from each other as they can be, because those pieces don't really need to explain themselves to a juror. Those pieces don't really have to teach the juror what they're seeing. If your pieces are unusual in some way, if they have a really unusual subject matter, if they're not conventionally attractive to look at, if there's something kind of difficult or challenging about them, you might need to show the jurors that idea 3 times to get one piece in. And if you really sell them on it, they might take all 3 of your pieces too. You know, you could still get all 3 in. But I think that when you're working in a way that's at all maybe a little less accessible, or a little less conventionally attractive, or kind of an unusual subject matter, you might find that you need to show something more than one, you need to show someone more than one example. And you need to keep your entry cohesive so that someone can look at this and say, well, I wouldn't have known what to do with one of these, but with three of these, I kind of get what they're on to. I kind of understand what they're doing here. So you might look at your work in terms of whether it is already something that a juror is going to be familiar with, in which case you might mix your entries up a little bit, or whether it's something where you have to kind of teach the juror what they're looking at, or help them acquire a taste for it by showing them more than one piece. And that's kind of tactical. You know, you just have to kind of sit down with your work and think about where it is in the scheme of what people are likely to understand or already have been exposed to. The idea of uniqueness is really important too. I have seen jurors just glom onto a piece and they just won't even consider not having it in the show. It's the only thing like it. It's nicely done. They feel like it puts something in the show that nothing else puts in the show. How are you going to say no to that? Now, obviously, it's much easier to say you should put in something unique than it is always to come up with something unique. But if you run that idea through your mind once in a while, as you're thinking about technique or you're choosing a subject matter, I think you could kind of get something out of that. And maybe you'd push your work, or maybe you'd push a particular piece you were working on in a different direction if it were intended for a competitive event, with the idea of uniqueness in mind. That standing out, I mean, unless it's really in a negative way, that standing out among entries is hard to argue with in a juried situation. It's really hard to argue with. We had a member show here, I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. It was a few ago. And one of the entries was this large rectangular painting that appeared to be plain black from a distance. And as you walked in closer to it, what emerged was that the surface was covered with figures which were kind of painted in almost a graffiti-like way, except more fluid than that, in kind of a medium blue color. And there were some images that were recognizable in an almost cartoonish kind of way, but you had these very fluid blue lines against a black rectangular background in this plain kind of dull silver frame. And you walked up to that piece, and then you kind of backed away from it, and then you kind of walked up to it again, then you kind of backed away from it. And the jurors who were selecting the show, they didn't stand around looking at it much at all. They didn't seem to talk about it. They didn't even necessarily even make a point of noticing it. And I gave them the 2 colors of Post-it notes that they were to use to indicate which pieces they wanted removed from the room. And we took away the things that they agreed didn't need to be in the show. And then I gave them the 2 colors of Post-it notes that they were to put on the pieces that they wanted to consider for awards in the remaining show. And those 2 jurors got their colors of Post-it notes, and they practically ran into each other, barging over to this blue and black painting to be the first one to put a note on it, indicating that that was the one that they thought was really important to consider for an award. And after watching them seem to ignore it for the whole jurying process, watching them run into each other to put a Post-it note on it for an award was kind of an amazing experience. And it was obvious that the piece had struck both of them in the same way. They had both obviously been very moved and impressed by this piece in a way that didn't even require any conversation. There was nothing else like it remotely in the room. The artist himself, against my advice, I have to say, had submitted no other pieces. There was just that from him. And that had impressed the jurors so completely as a beautifully done, absolutely unique, absolutely can't part with it piece that they ran into each other when it came time to select awards.
That is very fun. That is very fun.
It makes a very indelible memory, I have to say.
For sure.
And we can't all hope to submit something that's so inevitable as that, is to have jurors running into each other when it comes time to name the awards. But the point of uniqueness, not being interchangeable or exchangeable with another piece, think about that a little bit as you're deciding on what your subjects, on what your technique, on what your approach to a subject for a competitive event will be.
We have one more question here as well that, is flowing right along with that. Are pieces with a political or social message accepted easily, or should they be avoided from most shows?
I love that question.
Yeah, that could be kind of loaded. So
I don't remember where I read this, but someone very astutely observed that the problem with most political art is that if you like art, political art is too political and not enough art. And if what you really like is politics, you don't really want your politics watered down with art. Now, having said that,
that's an interesting way to put it, right?
having said that, though, I mean, there are masterpieces of art which are political. I mean, the Guernica mural of Picasso, just to kind of scoop the most obvious example out of the air. There's brilliant political art out there. But run that through your head a little bit. Is this too much art for people who like politics and too much politics for people who like art, or have I come up with the right blend here? I think most jurors would probably default to whether the piece was well done enough and made its point in a way that felt like the quality of the work carried the politics, if that makes sense. I think most jurors wouldn't want to feel that you were just kind of hanging on the politics. They'd still want to see a well done drawing or painting, and if there was a political message there, I think you'd probably have as many responses to that as you'd have jurors in terms of their comfort level. But if the piece were well done, I think you could get it in.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could get it in. There's an example that comes into my head a lot of the time. This is not at all political. This is kind of the opposite, but maybe it's the same thing. We had a couple of jurors come out from MIA and spend a very, very long time debating about including this beautifully done oil painting of Santa Claus. And it was beautifully done. There was no question that the person had mastered their medium. There was no question that this was about as nice a painting of Santa Claus as you would ever hope to see. But they kept stumbling on the fact that it was of Santa Claus. And they'd go around the room and make a round of removals, and they would go around the room and make another round of removals. And they kept coming back to Santa Claus. And Santa Claus was in the show until the very end of the jurying, and they came back to it for like about the seventh time, just having decided we're going to decide this once and for all now. And they finally did jury it out. But the quality of the painting, and these were both very highly trained curators from MIA going around and around about this. The quality of the painting kept a painting whose subject they would have rejected out of hand in the jurying for a very long time.
That's very, very interesting. We have one more question and then also a statement. First, I'm going to give you just a comment by one of our members, and this is a good statement. Political art is good for telling our history visually. Yeah. Most of the time, political art tells the truth of events better than what could be printed in the history books.
That's a good way to say it. Yes.
Right.
Yes. More then, complexly and yeah.
Right. We have another question, and this is about framing. Most shows have rules for entry for matting and framing to be very neutral. What are your thoughts on that? And can you explain if this is beneficial for the show and for jurying?
Oh, I love that question. I've had the opportunity to hang watercolor shows and botanical shows where the rules about the framing were very, very rigid. Like even a second bevel on a mat was not permitted or something like that. I mean, I'm probably getting that wrong, but it wasn't very difficult to run awry of the rules in these shows for what the matting and framing was. And you know, when a show comes in and all of the framing and matting is very neutral, you arrange that show according to the subjects of the pieces, and everything complements everything else. And the degree of focus that you achieve on those pieces is unlike in any other show, because none of your attention is hijacked by framing. And when there's a show where you have purple mats or you have crazy styles of frames, you find that you are arranging the show around framing as often as you are around the images. And we've had installations where conceptually, technique-wise, a particular piece belonged with a group of pieces. It was one of them. They should have been showable together, and it was matted and framed in a way that made it absolutely unhangable with the other pieces. And so we're taking this piece away from the pieces it should be shown with and putting it with some pieces that can hold up to a purple mat or some kind of crazy frame. You actually change where your work goes in a show by overstating or mischoosing the frame. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I hate to take all the fun out of framing, but the fact is there are lots of ways to spend a lot of money and get really, really beautiful frames that are still very, very neutral. You know, you can explore using a deeper mat. You can explore some subtle profiling to the frame molding. Some people buy commercial frames and they kind of subtly scuff and tone them with oil paints and glazes and stains and things. You can spend a lot of time on a surprisingly neutral mat and frame treatment. So I don't mean to take all the fun out of framing when I say that, but the moment you get more than a few pieces together, the framing, if it's neutral, allows you to hang the work, and the framing, if it's too overstated, has you dancing circles around the framing. It's unmistakable.
Right. That's good.
It's very important.
We have another question. Do shows conduct any training on racial or cultural bias for jurors to ensure the diversity of artists?
I think that's going to happen.
Mhm.
If it's not happening already, it's going to happen. That's
Mhm.
certainly something that the arts need to reflect.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And probably that will come in to the very selection of the jurors. You know, whether the jurors either have a broad exposure to a broad range of material culture from a broad range of sources, or if they don't.
Right.
That will certainly be another factor in the selection of jurors. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Under what to enter, I have the word showpieces in my notes. And having talked about uniqueness and other strategies, I do want to say something about showpieces, because I had a great conversation with someone who was very upset about how a beautiful weaving she had done showed up, or rather did not show up, in a show. And she'd put a lot of work into this, and it was a special technique. And she was understandably disappointed when it didn't feel like it was as important in the show as she was hoping that it would be. And so we walked into the gallery to look at it so we could talk about it. And the piece in question was this very subtly textured white weaving, which was beautifully done. It was obvious she'd mastered her work, but it was in a room full of works that had been selected by people who were thinking a little more competitively about the show and had picked more extroverted, colorful, look at me kinds of pieces. And so she and I had a conversation about what constitutes a showpiece and how maybe you have some pieces which are exquisitely done and reflect mastery and deserve to be in a show, but which maybe aren't going to get into some shows or aren't going to show up as well as they ought to, simply because you're putting them in a situation where maybe the more extroverted entries are going to dominate. And there is such a thing as a piece which, as masterful as it is maybe a little too quiet to compete in some of these events. And so you have to be able to separate whether you've picked a piece that speaks with a loud enough voice, maybe, if that's the way to say it. We don't always know what a showpiece is going to be, but we can sometimes look at a very quiet and refined piece and evaluate the kind of show that we're entering, and maybe be aware of the fact that maybe that's not a piece for that show. And there again, it's not about the quality of your work or anyone's intention. It's just about the other pieces in the show. In my section, How is a Show Judged and Selected, I talk about the jurors' expertise providing knowledge. And hopefully, you know, as we were already talking about, hopefully the jurors have been selected in such a way that they do have this knowledge and they do understand the kinds of pieces that they're going to be encountering as they jury the show for you. The other entries are providing the context for the selections, and your own presentation and mastery is another very, very important factor. And we've talked about maybe needing 3 pieces in order to show someone what you're doing if it's a little unusual. But the other thing you get out of putting your work out in a competitive way for jurying or for a show, the other thing you get out of it is getting a chance to kind of look over your work and think, am I really presenting this as well as I should? Is my presentation up to snuff? Is there something I need to learn about framing? Is there an upgrade I need to make in how I'm putting my work out, how I'm presenting it? One of your best ways to evaluate your framing is going to be to go to the show that you do or don't get into. I think there's maybe no better way to really learn about framing than to go to some of these shows, either the mixed ones or more specific ones like a watercolor show. Look at what the other people have on their pieces. I think framing shops can be really confusing. You know, their job is to sell moldings. They'd like to pull out all the fun moldings and use those. Some of them would look really, really good in your house, but they're maybe not the right moldings for shows. And if you go to shows regularly and make a point of going through once, not looking at the art very much at all, but look at the matting and the framing, see what the other people are up to, see if you can get some ideas from that, see if you're kind of bored with how you're matting and framing things, or if you just haven't thought about it yet, see if you can get some ideas from looking at someone else do it. Because I think there are lots of good ideas out there, and I think it's much easier to understand the impact of a matting and framing decision when you see it on a wall than it is when you see a corner of it in a frame shop stacked with 8,000 other options. I think that's very confusing. So isolating your work, kind of thinking about your presentation, whether you're really nailing it or whether you've got some work to do, this is another good chance to do that. And going to the show that you either got into or didn't get into and seeing what they picked and what those things look like and how other people are doing their matting and framing can be really valuable. And you don't have to listen to one person's voice then. You go through and look around until you see something that feels right to you or that feels like you can learn something from. My next section of my notes, why is this activity useful? Coming back to the idea of entering a juried event, providing you an opportunity to think critically about your work. Spreading it out. What do I have available? What should I put in? How am I presenting myself? It might be the only time you kind of compare your pieces to each other or compare one group of pieces to each other to another group. Where am I technically strongest? Which of my ideas seems to be most successful? Which group of work seems to be emerging as my dominant interest? Were you intending to develop some idea that you've left behind? This is a good time to do it. I remember putting out pieces for a show once and thinking, okay, this is terrific as long as somebody wants to buy a bowl or a vase, but what if they don't? And then I thought, well, let's get some plates in there. Let's get some candlesticks in there. I mean, you get everything you make together and you can kind of see what's missing sometimes. It helps. It helps a lot. And you might also learn that you have an interest in some area that other people don't, or you might have an interest in a subject that other people don't. And you might have to tacticize your entries a little bit. You might have to think, you know, is this something I really think is going to do well in this particular juried event or this particular selective event, or is this just something I really like? And again, the idea of a sense of humor rather, is important. There will be pieces that you really have a weak spot for that you really like. You like doing them. You're happy with how they worked out. They might not get into the shows you'd like them to get into. They might just be for you. And we've all got things like that. And we need to do those things for us. But sometimes those aren't our strongest competitors when we go to be in a show. I also believe in letting people communicate to you that they don't particularly like or understand what you did. I think you can get a lot out of talking with somebody like that if you don't take it too personally. They might just be talking about some baggage they have. You might learn something from them about how you're approaching the subject that makes you think, oh, if I did it this way, they would be open to it. Or maybe they're right. I'm assuming that the people looking at my work like this appreciate this quality, or they appreciate this idea. Maybe I should kind of blow that up a little bit and see if I can solve that some other way.
Mhm.
Some of my favorite ideas, some of my favorite things that sit in my mind over the years are things that people said when they didn't like what I was doing. And your first thought is, well, hell with you then. But if you think about it a little bit, if you kind of roll it around in your head, you can kind of think, oh, well, what if this person holding this big vase that I'm really proud of says, I would use this more if it were smaller. If I can stop thinking, well, I made that, that's what I have. If I can get it through my head next time I sit down to make some things, try some smaller shapes, give it a shot. I mean, you can get some good tips sometimes from someone just blurting out something that they don't prefer about your work. I think if you do that a little bit, you can get more comfortable hearing someone disagree with you. And one of the first things that I put on my notes for this is the artistic freedom idea. And I want you to remind yourself that it runs both ways. As artists, as makers, we get to make what we want. But the other side of that is that if someone else doesn't particularly find it interesting, they get to feel that way about it, So I think we have to enjoy and expect and accept both aspects of that artistic freedom. Make what you want, but understand that everyone else is free to like it or not like it, or understand it or not understand it. And maybe you can have a nice conversation about it after that.
Right.
I think there's a lot to be learned from talking with people who disagree with you about all of this, because there are so many good veins of ideas. There are so many, people have been making art ever since they've been doing anything. Nobody's going to know it all or make all the right choices. They're just not going to. It's not going to happen.
Excuse me, Bob, that's a good lead into one of our last questions here. We're coming on 8 o'clock. And the question is, do you think most jurors are open to a person respectfully asking them to talk about their piece with them individually after the jury?
There's a part of me that wishes for those who would like it that everyone could have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because the juror might say something you could really use. The juror might say, well, there were 3 other paintings of sheep in a meadow, and we thought yours was less good than the other 2. Or they might say something to you like, well, we just had too many landscapes in the show. It might not be about your work at all. And when you don't get into an event, you don't know necessarily. You can go to the show, which I recommend, and see if you can understand where your entry fit into the other entries, into the context of the show. But boy, some of those jurors would have something really terrific that you could learn from. And some of those jurors would say something like, we had too many landscapes, or we had too many abstracts, or something like that, that isn't about your work. It doesn't mean you should do anything different. It's just how it came out that time. Mm-hmm. And that's why we kind of have to keep an open mind about getting into or not getting into some of these events, because sometimes it's just not the right group of pieces for your piece to be in the show. And there isn't something to learn from it. There isn't always.
That's a good point. Sometimes there's, just other circumstances, and there isn't always a big aha, with why you did or didn't get into a show.
There isn't always. And that's why I really recommend doing it more than once, competing more than once. 1 or 2 isolated incidents don't give you very much of a landscape in which to start understanding why you're getting in or why you're not getting in. But if you do this regularly, you will start to put that together for yourself, I think.
Right, we have one more question here before the end, and then we can kind of wrap it up, and maybe you can give us a couple of,
Good. I'd like to go over my entry checklist at the end, just to kind of touch on some things we've already talked about a little bit.
Perfect.
Okay.
Is it considered, this is just kind of another little piece about our last question. Is it considered inappropriate to ask who the jurors are before you submit your work?
I don't see how that could be inappropriate. It could be helpful.
Right.
You could think,
Right.
well, so-and-so doesn't like florals, or
Right.
there are shows. I mean, some prestigious shows will make a point of saying who the jurors are, because the jurors themselves carry prestige that adds prestige to the show. And then by extension, of course, you have the opportunity to imagine that you can guess what each of their tastes is going to be. But really, when you get those jurors into a room, or when you get them at a computer going through electronic entries, whether or not they pick what you think they're going to pick is probably anyone's guess. So that might not actually be a benefit.
Right.
But when you can know it, I think that's entirely appropriate. I put an entry checklist in the notes just to kind of summarize some of these points. Have I given myself as many chances as possible to be selected? Make them say no again and again. I think the more experiences you can get with getting that no and kind of thickening your skin against it, the sooner it can be a non-issue for you, and you can get back to concentrating on your work, which is where your focus belongs. And then probably right about the time you stop caring about some of these rejections, they'll turn into acceptances anyway, and you'll go, oh, what happened with that? Does each of my entries sell my mastery of what I do? And this again is your chance to really go over what you're putting in. Pick it apart, your mastery of your medium, your presentation skills, everything. Try to get out of your head a little bit, try to get out of your preferences a little bit. Really try to put on your juror hat as well as you can. Does my entry rely too heavily on one idea? Do the jurors have to absolutely love one particular thing, or have you spread it out a little bit for them? It's a tactical issue. Again, it relates to whether you're showing them something new that you need to show them more than one of, or if you're showing them more traditional pieces that don't require as much of an explanation, and then maybe you can break your entry up a little bit. Does my entry offer the jurors the chance to include something unique in the show? Yeah, it's not about the jurors. It really isn't. It's about you. You want to be in the show, but help them, give them something that they just can't live without. So if that helps you push your technique, if that helps you push your choice of subject a little bit, if you can use that as an inspiration for trying something new or for pushing something a little bit beyond your usual boundaries of comfort, again, that could be something that helps you with your work. And you should get something out of this process. You should get something out of looking at your work, submitting your work for jurying. Whether or not you get into that show, there are things you can get out of that. And they're worth getting, and they'll help you be a better artist.
This has been very cool. It's been really, really inspirational, I think. And it is to me, and I believe to all of us. And I think that just for us to be able to reflect on process, and understand that process is very much a learning and a growing piece of being an artist.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's been really wonderful. And one of our members, Kristen, says, no matter, no does make your work better. More no makes better work over time. So
it contributes even when it kind of hurts a little bit, because some of these no's come around and you kind of think, well, what if I did this? And I've had very productive ideas come out of someone saying something that they did not intend to be helpful.
Right.
If you can use that as a tool, you're going to benefit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Members are saying that they really love the presentation. I've heard that it's been very fantastic. It's very informative. So we really appreciate you being here tonight. I think that it's been really great. And I'm looking forward to going back over my notes before I submit my next piece. So
I've enjoyed this too. I love this process, as frustrating as it can be. I really think it's important.
Right. It surely is. It surely is. Thank you, Bob, very much. We really enjoyed having you here, and we will look forward. Everybody can go out to the show at Minnetonka Center for the Arts.
Yes,
They've
please
got
do.
they've got a show out there that Bob's got going. So we hope to see you out there in the near future.
Please visit. Thank
All
you very
right.
Thanks,
much.
Bob.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Good night.
Good night.